going to give pointers about how to study the Bible with someone, then we probably would have gone with the notion in times past that the person that we're studying with already believed in God and already believed that the Bible is God's Word. But that is not the case any longer. Believing in God is no longer the norm in our society like it used to be. The number of people who are certain that God exists is dropping. And that is why it is even more relevant what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Christians, let me ask you this. If someone were to come up to you and they were to ask you, tell me why you believe that God exists, what would you say? Would you say, well, because I always have believed that God exists? Or maybe you would say, well, my parents raised me to believe that God exists. Maybe you would say, I don't know why I believe that God exists, I just do. Well, 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15 tells me that those answers are unacceptable, especially in the times in which we live. Because we live in a time when more and more people question whether or not God exists. And they question why they believe in Him. And so Christians, if you are trying to bring the gospel to someone, if you're trying to study with someone, these days it is very likely that they will ask, well, how do you know for sure that God exists? 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15 lets us know that God expects us to be ready to give an answer to that question. And the thing is, Christians, we are 100% sure that God exists, and we can prove it. Now, when atheists and agnostics hear me say that we can prove the existence of God, they'll scoff at that. You can't prove that God exists. Can you see God, Christian? Can you hear God, Christian? No, you can't. And so you can't prove that God exists. Well, brethren, here is what they are overlooking. I want you to consider this very carefully. Our five senses are not the only tools we use to determine truth. There are other methods that people use to confidently and correctly conclude the existence of people and things which we do not perceive with our five senses. Law enforcement does this all the time. They depend on what legal authorities call prima facie evidence. Now, prima facie evidence is fancy lawyer speak, which basically describes evidence which establishes the presumption of fact and will legally stand as fact if it cannot be refuted. Now, most of this evidence does not come through observation. Some of it results from deduction. I have a friend who's a police officer, and he explained it to me in this way. He said that if he came across a 15-year-old who had no cans of beer in his possessions, and yet he smelled very strongly like beer, then legal authorities would consider that to be enough evidence to indict the teenager with the charge of possession of alcohol by a minor, even though the officer did not see with his own eyes that the boy was holding any beer. All of us do this, you know. Even atheists and agnostics do this. For example, have you ever seen Abraham Lincoln? Have you ever heard Abraham Lincoln speak with your own ears? We are living in the year 2020. No one living today can say that they have seen or heard Abraham Lincoln. So how can we confidently say that Lincoln existed? Well, we know he existed because we have accepted reliable testimony, which verifies his existence. We've read the history books. We've seen the monuments. We've visited the museums. We take in all the testimony about Lincoln's life and what he did, and what do? We come to the correct and confident conclusion that Abraham Lincoln existed, even though we've never seen him, we've never heard him, we've never touched him, we've never smelled him. And in the same way, there is a lot of reliable testimony which verifies the existence of God. For example, the reliable testimony of right and wrong. You know, our conscience is a funny thing. Our conscience is the part of our mind that makes us feel guilty when we do something wrong, and yet it also remains quiet when we do something right. In Romans chapter 2, verse 15, the Apostle Paul said that our conscience is our thoughts, which either accuse or excuse us. But here's the thing about our conscience. In order to either accuse or excuse us, our conscience must recognize the existence of good and evil, right and wrong. So if there is in fact no such thing as absolute good and absolute evil, then why do our consciences act as if good and evil exist? You know, it's obvious that some things are in fact good while other things are evil. Some actions are right while other actions are wrong. Now, my little girls love to watch Frozen. And parents, we might smile as our kids sing along with Elsa in the movie Frozen when she sings, "No right, no wrong, no rules for me." But parents, you and I both know that if we met someone in real life who actually promoted the philosophy of no right, no wrong, no rules for me, we would think them either insane or at the very least extremely immature. Ask anyone who believes no right, no wrong, no rules for me. Ask them if it's okay to steal from them, if it's okay to rape them or their loved ones. Ask them if it's okay to take their life. See how long they hold on to the anything goes philosophy. Even the most unethical among us cries out for justice whenever another immoral person hurts them in any way. So, friends, right and wrong do exist. Even people who don't believe in God will agree with people who do believe in God that right and wrong exist. Now, there's not universal agreement on what constitutes right and wrong. That is true, but everyone agrees that the line between good and bad exists. So here's my question. Who or what drew that line? Who or what determines what is right, what is wrong? Is there an absolute, ultimate standard put in place which says what is right or wrong? And if there is, whose standard is it? What is it? Why is there a line drawn in the first place? Now, atheists would say, well, God did not draw the line because God does not exist. Okay, all right, let's say, for the sake of argument, that God does not exist. Let's say that Darwin is right and we all evolved from monkeys. Where did we get our morality from? Did we get our morality from the monkeys? There's no evidence to suggest that we did. When you look at the animal kingdom, animals kill and steal from each other with impunity. And there's no sign of remorse, even when they kill their own children, as they so often do. And yet, we human beings, who supposedly evolved from animals, we do feel remorse when we kill and steal and violate our moral standards. And we also feel the need to punish those who violate our code. And we even feel the need to discuss these things like I'm doing right now. Have you ever seen any monkey tell another monkey that they need to discuss morality or ethics? Obviously not. You know, some atheists do in fact concede this. One of them, Dr. George G. Simpson, admitted that, quote, morals arise only in man, unquote. So here's the question. Did we come up with morality ourselves? Well, think about this. Let's picture two cavemen. And they're sitting around the fire way back at the beginning of time. They're sitting around the fire, and right next to them is the unconscious woman that they've just clubbed over the head, and they just finished raping her because they had primitive animalistic urges and they wanted to satisfy them. Now picture this. Say that suddenly one of these cavemen says to the other one, you know, we just did something bad. Hey, I have a proposal. I propose that from now on, we ask the woman for her permission first. In fact, I think it would be good for each from now on that we would need to fall in love with a woman first and have her fall in love with us, and that both of us make a lifelong commitment of monogamy before anything sexual happens. Let's call this commitment marriage. Yeah, that sounds good. Marriage. Oh, and also knocking her unconscious from now on, that's a no-no. No. In fact, violent behavior towards anyone in general is taboo from here on out. Does that sound good? Can you imagine a caveman just on his own coming up with standards of morality? It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Why would the caveman have come up with these morals in the first place? Because after all, he's not doing himself any favors by putting these limitations on himself. Because as it is, without morality, he can satisfy any urge, any desire that comes upon him the way things are right now. He's living a completely self-centered, anything goes, no right, no wrong, no for me kind of life. He's the king of his world. So come up with these rules of right and wrong that would require him to practice discipline and sacrifice, and would require him to put others before himself. What influenced him to do this? Another caveman? Okay, well, where did that caveman get the idea? Not from the animals, that's for sure. Well, okay, did the caveman evolve to think such things? That's what the atheist would say. Atheists say that morality is the product of evolution. But here's the question I have about that. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that morality can be the product of evolution, because I thought the whole reason behind evolution is survival of the fittest. Remember what Charles Darwin's book is called, On the Origin of Species. Now that's the shortened title, but look at the screen. Here's the full title of Charles Darwin's famous book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Race in the Struggle for Life. Think about that. Darwin's macroevolution is said to occur primarily to preserve a species from extinction. Darwin says that we evolved from animals. So my question is, why do we see living, breathing, completely immoral animals around us every day? Animals have no sense of right and wrong, and they seem to be surviving just fine without it. And so morality is not the product of evolution. Here's the thing. When you take God out of the picture, you can't establish the how or the why of morality. But here's the next question. Can we determine exactly what is moral or immoral if God does not exist? The humanists among us tried a few decades back when they wrote Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2. They said in these works, ethics is autonomous and situational, needing no theological or ideological sanction. And in other words, I can do wrong in certain situations and it's okay. But since I am a law to myself, and so I determine for myself what's right and wrong, I won't ever be in that kind of situation in the first place where I can do wrong in certain situations and it's okay. You know, that's pretty convenient, isn't it? The caveman would approve. And so would your average convict in any prison on the planet when you think about it. And this is why some atheists do try to be consistent, because they realize that if God doesn't exist, then as far as morality goes, anything goes. Atheist John Paul Sartre, he admitted this. He said, if God does not exist, we are not provided with any values or commands that could legitimize our behavior. And here's what's very interesting. A few years before John Paul Sartre said that, there was someone else who said pretty much the same thing. You want to know who it was? It was Dr. Otto Stammer, the defense attorney for Nazi leader Hermann Göring. And he made this defense during the Nuremberg trials. What Stammer was doing was challenging the legality of any indictment the Allies made against his client. And what he was saying in his defense was that Göring and the Nazis were simply following the laws of their country when they murdered thousands of Jews. And he said they were not in any violation of any universal international standard of right and wrong. Now, the chief prosecutor of the United Kingdom, Sir Hartley Shawcross, he disagreed. And he said in the Nuremberg trials, quote, ultimately, the rights of men, made as all men are made in the image of God, are fundamental. So here we have the defense attorney of the Nazis, the people basically following Darwin's idea of the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. We have this defense attorney of the Nazis trying to get his clients off the hook by saying that there is no universal standard of right and wrong. That is the same notion that one is forced to conclude when one tries to explain morality without the existence of God. And we also see the guys that were working to punish the Nazis at the Nuremberg trials, they're the ones who are talking about men being made in the image of God. They're the ones that are saying the rights of men are fundamental for that reason, because we are all made in the image of God. That is very, very interesting. You see, here's the thing. Morality undoubtedly exists. But if God does not exist, then how does anyone explain morality? Morality could not have come about through evolution. It could not have come about by what we observe the animals doing. In fact, it doesn't make sense to think that we ourselves came up with the idea of right and wrong, because if we did that, we would be putting limits on our own behavior. So what's the only option that remains? That only option is God. You want reliable testimony that God exists? Listen to your conscience. The only thing that explains that your conscience even exists in the first place is God. The Bible says in Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 29, see, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. That's true. So you want reliable testimony of the existence of God? Morality. The existence of morality is reliable testimony that God exists. But there's more too. You want other reliable testimony that God exists? Look at the reliable testimony of design. I want you to consider this world that we live in. Look around the world. Look at how the world operates. The closer you get to the equator, the warmer it gets. The farther away from the equator you get, the colder it gets. Look at your calendars. The calendars are based on the phases of the moon. Why? Because the phases of the moon are so predictable. It gets warm in the spring. It gets hot in the summer. It gets cool in the fall. It gets cold in the winter. But look also at where our planet is positioned in the solar system. Did you know that planet Earth is located at exactly the correct distance from the sun in order to receive the right amount of heat and the right amount of radiation to sustain life as we know it? If the Earth was moved any closer or further away from the sun, life would cease to exist on this planet. Did you know that? Look at the intricacies of your own body. For example, look at your eye. Take your eye, for example. Have you ever wondered how your eye works? Scientists tell us that the eye receives 1.5 million messages all at the same time. It sorts through them and it sends them to the brain. The eye is self-cleaning. Did you know that? Our tears contain a powerful microbe killer that guards our eyes against bacterial infection. In fact, the eye works so well that tech companies model cameras after it. And yet, if you take the most technologically advanced camera and you compare it to your eye, that camera would be a clumsy replica. If you found a camera lying on the ground, let me ask you this. Would you think that that camera just happened by chance? Or would you think that someone made the camera? And yet the average human being has two eyes, and those two eyes make a camera look like a kindergarten toy. In fact, even Charles Darwin said that it is hard to believe that the eye could exist by accident. You look at the intricacies of our bodies. You look at the distance that our planet is from the sun. You look at the reliable and continual patterns of the weather, and so much all around you. They all have in common. They all have in common design. To think that an act caused the continual, precise, predictable actions of our planet and our universe. None of it could have come about by pure chance. Even atheists are forced to concede the obvious conclusions of design. There's an evolutionist by the name of Harold Morowitz, and he estimated that the probability for the chance formation of the smallest, simplest form of living organism is known in 1 in 1 to the 10th, 1 in 10 to the 340th million power. And yet they expect us to just believe that all of this happened as the result of some freak accident. You probably heard of atheist Richard Dawkins. Well, Richard Dawkins was interviewed back in 2008 by Ben Stein for Ben Stein's documentary Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And Stein, what do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or Darwinian evolution? Now, Richard Dawkins is perhaps the most famous and renowned atheist in the entire world. And he admitted in that interview that the detailed workings of biochemistry and molecular biology that we see in nature, that we see in the universe, that they are evidence of intelligent design. But he wasn't willing to. And so you want to know what Richard Dawkins attributed the intelligent design of our universe to? Watch the documentary. Here's what he said. Aliens. Aliens. Richard Dawkins, Oxford professor, best-selling author, militant atheist says aliens created life on this planet. Okay. All right, well, here's my question. Who created the aliens that created us? Was it other aliens? Okay, well, who created them? Now, Dawkins says in the interview that they must have evolved probably by some sort of Darwinian evolution. And so that means that these aliens, if they evolved, that means that they're not eternal. So where did the aliens come from? Well, here's another theory that Richard Dawkins promoted in the interview. He theorized that crystals are the cause of life on this planet. Crystals are the cause of life. Okay, well, who made the crystals? Where did the crystals come from? You see, without an intelligent designer, there's a big problem. If there is no God, it is hard to explain the design that is seen in the world around us. So do you want reliable testimony of God's existence? All you have to do is simply look around you and think about the intricate design of everything you see, including you. And that's what Paul was talking about in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, when he said, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." You want reliable testimony about the existence of God? Look at the design that is very much evident in the world around us. But there's more reliable testimony as well. There's the reliable testimony of science itself. Christians, don't ever let anyone tell you that science and Christianity are incompatible. Now, that's a popular notion these days, but it's not true. Science and Christianity are very much compatible. For example, take the law of biogenesis. Now, atheists, they do not believe that God exists, and so they believe that life comes from non-life. This theory is called spontaneous generation. It's the idea that living organisms develop from non-living matter. Now, people who believed this a few centuries ago, here's what they actually thought. They thought that if you wrapped pieces of cheese and bread in rags and left them alone in a dark corner for a few weeks, that's how you would get mice. Can you believe that? But that's what people actually thought about 300, 400 years ago. But the proven law of biogenesis, which was proven in part by Louis Pasteur, among others, the law of biogenesis basically states that life comes only from life. And not only that, but the law of biogenesis also states that life comes only from that of its own kind. Biologist R.L. Weissong put it this way: kinds only reproduce their own kinds. You know, we see this every single day. Dogs reproduce, and is a kitten born? No, a puppy is born. Monkeys reproduce, and is the result a human being? No, it's another monkey. It is very, very silly to think that a bird could evolve from a lizard or a human being could evolve from an ape, but that's what's being taught by so many, and it's in direct violation of the proven science, which is the law of biogenesis. And the law of biogenesis also backs up the Bible, by the way. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 24 through 25, it says very, very specifically that kinds will come only from their own kind. Read that passage. Now, atheists say that life comes only from non-life, but proven science says that life comes from life, and God says the same thing. Now, atheists say that one organism evolves into a completely different organism, but proven science doesn't say that. Proven science says that like produces like. And so does God, by the way, in Genesis chapter 1. Imagine that. But here's another example. What about the first and second laws of thermodynamics? Now, atheists, they say that there is no God. They say that the notion that God created the universe is ridiculous. And yet, the universe exists. So if there is no God, how does the universe exist? There are only two options. Either the universe created itself, or the universe is eternal. Now, Dr. Stephen Hawking, who was an atheist, he believed that the universe created itself. But you see, that goes against the first law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics states that neither matter nor energy can be created or destroyed. In other words, it's scientifically impossible for the universe to have created itself. And so, according to the atheist, the other option would be that the universe is eternal. There's an agnostic by the name of Dr. Robert Jastrow, and he admits that evolutionists like the idea of an eternal universe. But Jastrow also concedes that the notion of an eternal universe isn't scientifically feasible. And the reason why it isn't scientifically feasible is because the second law of thermodynamics says so. You see, the second law of thermodynamics teaches that while matter and energy cannot be destroyed per the first law of thermodynamics, they are gradually decreasing in quality as time goes by. And that means it's impossible for the universe to be eternal. The website allaboutscience.org, here's how they put it, quote, "Like a wind-up clock, the universe is winding down, as if at one point it was fully wound up and has been winding down ever since. The question is, who wound up the clock?" That is a very, very good question. Who did wind up the clock? The only feasible answer is something that is unacceptable to the atheist. And Dr. Jastrow acknowledges this. Here's what he said. "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." Christians, when you are studying with someone about the existence of God, you need to explain to them why those theologians have been sitting on top of that scientific mountain for all of this time. And the reason is because Christians believe what Hebrews chapter 3 verse 4 says. "For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God." You want reliable testimony of the existence of God? Look at the true proven science, such as the law of biogenesis and the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Now, you know, there's a lot more that we could talk about along these lines. We could talk about how the proven scientific law of cause and effect proves the existence of God, and it also backs up the biblical teaching that God is eternal and no one created him. We could spend an entire video talking about the evidence that shows that the Bible is the Word of God, and I hope to make a video in the future that covers that. But to close out this video, I would like for us to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 21. You know, Charles Darwin was not a big fan in the idea that God exists. He was not a big fan of that. Now, he did admit more than once that it's reasonable to believe in God and unreasonable to reject God. And yet Darwin was still so determined to not believe in God that he was willing to destroy reason when that same reason led him to God. It is so sad that Darwin's influence still lives on today. But when we honestly examine the world around us and we honestly look at how the world operates, it still leads us to the inescapable conclusion that God exists. There are so many who are so stubborn, they just refuse to see that. And they brag about believing in science over religion. And all the while they're ignoring that science backs up the religion that they hate. And what they're doing is proving what God inspired Paul to write in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 21. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, notice, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. Think about what that means. Let's keep reading. Verse 20. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know, pleased God, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. This is why we must not be discouraged, Christians. This is why we must be encouraged instead. Because we know the truth. We believe it. And God wants us to share it with others. Remember 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. We must always be prepared to give an answer to the people who ask us for a reason for the hope that is in us. When people ask us why God exists, why we believe God exists, we must be prepared to give them that answer. And I hope that this video has helped you be prepared to give that answer to the person that you are studying with. Thank you for watching.